And that was a perfect introduction for our next speaker, Mr. Ian Urbina.
So my name is Ian Urbina. I'm a reporter with the New York Times. In my allotted 6 minutes, I was going to try to answer 3 basic questions. One was, what was this series that we ran and is still ongoing, The Outlaw Ocean, about? The second question was, what were sort of some of the high altitude big thoughts that emerged from the reporting? And then the third question was, where might there be sort of rays of hope for fixes to some of these problems? The series set out to explore that space that is 2/3 of the planet and in many ways is, in many places, ungoverned and ungovernable. And more specifically, it set out to broaden the diversity of understanding about the types of illegality that exists out there. So apart from just the Captain Phillips Somali piracy type story, intentional dumping or illegal fishing even, we wanted to explore the broader range of crimes. In the end, or thus far, that spectrum looks like the murder of stowaways, where stowaways are found and set on a raft far off from shore, cut loose and left to die. A fairly organized realm of gun trafficking and privatized maritime security, floating armories that exist out there, usually on the line between national and international waters, largely unregulated, sometimes quite violent. Intentional dumping on an order that shocked us. Every 3 years, ships dump in the oceans more oil and sludge than the Exxon Valdez and the BP spill combined. Obviously illegal and overfishing, and a variety of other crimes. So it was a real eye-opener as to man's inhumanity to man that occurs offshore. Some of the bigger sort of meta thoughts that emerged. One, for me, was something I still struggle with, and that is the definition of IUU, illegal, unregulated, unreported fishing. What emerged as a tough thought experiment for us was what really constitutes illegal fishing, and more specifically, as we, the globe, and nations in particular, and the consumer, attempt to grapple with better policing against illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, does that definition include the plight of those who work out there? So do the fishers matter as much as the fish? And by that I mean questions that might cross the threshold of illegality that would include the fishers, the fishermen and women. Are they documented? Or are they trafficked via debt bondage? Did all of them show back up at port? Did some disappear en route? Were they beaten on the ship? What sort of violence exists? Ultimately, were they paid? What were they paid? These are tough questions, and they're questions about the people on deck. And most of the discussion I found of IUU tends to focus, and for lots of good reasons, less on the people than on the marine environment and the environmental questions. That struck me as a big problem, and something that definitionally I think the community is going to have to struggle with. I think the second question was the perennial silo problem, and this exists in the U.S. government, it exists in all governments, and it exists in the industry. And that is, it typically looks like, well, we are the agency that just look out for fish, and it's hard enough to figure out if those 200 pounds, 200 tons of tilapia are really tilapia, and where it was caught, and whether it was caught with the ship that was permitted. That's a tough enough question in the supply chain. To now add to the question whether those deckhands, were legal and abused or not, is a tough thing for one agency to take on. The next agency says, we just work on human rights, and usually we're onshore, and we don't get invited to the meetings that are offshore. The third agency says, look, we're promoting trade, trying to better everyone's stake in life, and you bog these things down with too many rules, that deal won't go forward. and on and on. And I do think that this conference is probably the prime place where the blue-green divide, if you will, and these questions will have to be confronted. Hope, not a currency I usually peddle in. I focus on the negative stuff. But I do think there is hope. I do think that in the last year, driven by many of the people in this room, there's a lot happening in the realm of seafood traceability. I do also think that it's probably going to emerge, or is already emerging, in a sort of combination of the market, consumers, industry, and governments that seek to push into place not just rules that dictate, was that drift net caught or unpermitted, but rather, was there a crew manifest on that ship, and was that ship, did it have tracking, AIS, VMS, all these sorts of questions. And so I guess I will finish by saying, in the realm of hope, I think that there are large stakeholders in the room, governments included, who are big buyers, and buyers can often dictate purchasing policy, and purchasing policy is often what drives the market. And so in my final 30 seconds, I'll say, I think in terms of hope, the buyers, be they government or others, all the way down to consumers, asking more questions about both the conditions below deck and on deck, is probably where we might see the most change coming on these issues. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that, Ian. You remind me of a quote I heard, and that's, leaders need to be brokers of hope, and they can never appear to be bankrupt. So I think you've definitely inspired us to that.